Ben, hit me up. What you got, buddy?
Hey, bud. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. So I think earlier today you described yourself as a gender abolitionist, right?
That's me.
All right. I feel like that's sort of been my stance ever since the whole trans issues thing came to more of the social forefront a few years ago. But among my leftist friends, I feel like that's not a view that's represented very often.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple questions for you, which is, one, why do you think that is? And then two, would you agree that there are like seriously negative consequences in terms of the whole team sports dynamics of politics in the US at the very least, for that sort of thing not being well represented? The angle that I'm going for with that kind of being that it's really easy to attack the gender identity exclusive view of things. I feel like, especially if you're the kind of average Joe person that doesn't spend all day talking about this shit, right? And I feel like not presenting something that can hold up to more scrutiny without a bunch of alternative definitions of really commonplace words. I feel like not at least presenting that angle and letting people know that that's something that exists, but like just for the common person, just sort of is going to inherently divide the common person further away from this issue, and it's going to prevent social progress, at least in that aspect. Would you agree with that?
Wait, what is the question here? Sorry, I got lost along this. That's okay.
Okay, so the views that are usually presented when people bring up trans issues is that
Okay.
the terms man and woman, for example, and to some lesser extent among some parts of the trans community, male and female, are referring specifically to a person's gender or at least their gender expression or various things like this in certain contexts, right?
Wait, okay, wait, ignore all this. Wait, what is the question? Wait, just hit me up with the question.
All right, team sports issues in the U.S., right? Like the whole left versus right, it's me versus them mentality. Do you feel like trans issues being in the forefront of social discussion like this, with not having something like gender abolitionism ever as part of the conversation, do you feel like that is inherently going to further the divide, being someone who themselves does not necessarily agree with a lot of the trans identity angles of things?
Wait, what is the question? Are we just asking if we shouldn't talk about trans issues because it might divide people?
No, I'm saying, do you feel like we talk about it in the wrong way? Do you feel like we should be talking about it in a broader sense of things, right? The gender abolitionism as a concept should get at least more attention than it does.
Okay, so should we talk about gender abolitionism more?
Right. And, I mean, there's sort of a side angle of this, which is I feel like the only really popular people that talk about this sort of thing are going to be, on one hand, people like Ben Shapiro that have absolutely no fucking idea what they're talking about, or on the completely opposite end, someone like ContraPoints, who will sometimes kind of sideways acknowledge some of these ideas, but then also kind of write them off and be like, you know what, that's just not me, and somebody else can talk about that, even though I'm the one with a really big audience.
I think gender abolitionism is a very extreme position to take based on where societal values are right now, so it's probably not worth it to talk about it much. I don't think you're going to move very many people on it, and all you'll probably do is alienate audiences talking about it.
Do you not feel like there's a very substantial portion of the population that is absolutely never going to move with just the gender identity argument, though?
Probably, but it's going to be much, much, much smaller than the portion of people that can be moved, or the amount of people that can be moved to come on board with like trans issues is going to be much larger than the amount of people that can be in favor of total abolition of gender norms, or like of gender as a concept, period.
So, this is kind of a weird thing to talk about because it gets into more of the long-term thing. Like, you can't, at any given snapshot in history, right? Like, you can optimize for a single given thing, but as soon as you try and factor in time, it becomes a little more difficult, right? So I think the way that I usually would think about it would be that I feel like later on down the line, if this is a framework which we would not defend, let's say 50 years from now, that it's at some point in the future going to make it a lot more difficult to convince people of some other framework later on down the line, right? If we say that, oh, you know, actually, really, I never really 100% bought into this other thing.
Wait, but isn't that exactly how all of
these?
Isn't that how all these issues work? First, we push for decriminalization of gay relationships, then we push for civil unions, and then we make it so we can get married. First, we make it so that black people can't be slaves anymore. Then we vote to give them the right to vote. Then we give them more civil rights. Isn't this exactly how all of these issues in the past have gone?
Sure, but like if you wanted to take slavery as just like a sort of example to go by, even like before the country was established, right? There were hardcore abolitionists that were at the forefront writing lots and lots of essays that were prominent people, right? That were putting these ideas out there, even if they were not the mainstream ideas that got accepted immediately, right? Like there was always like a group in the middle that was sort of, conceding, tinier points step by step. But I feel like the more extreme positions were always getting some amount of public attention. I don't.
I mean,
feel
but
like
yeah,
that's
sure.
the
But
case
I mean, I
most
think the
out
extreme positions are being represented now, right? Like, they're just not as like mainstream, which would probably have been the same back in the days of like when people were talking about getting rid of slavery. I doubt that there were any mainstream figures saying like, not only should we get rid of slavery, like black people should be seen as full citizens and no segregation, blah blah blah. Like, nobody probably would have listened to a person like that, I imagine.
I mean, we could spend some time trying to fact check this. I don't have like the strongest history background to immediately cite a lot of examples, but I feel like there were abolitionists in the Revolutionary period that were saying that like black people are just as good as white people and they should actually be considered citizens. Like even if they weren't super prominently saying that in public
I mean, like,
speech.
I mean, we can look and see if like this is just one example. My history's shit, but like, was Abraham
Right.
Lincoln talking about giving black people like full like constitutional rights and like desegregation and everything of slaves? Like, was this really a thing that like people like very prominent figures were arguing?
On the note of Abraham Lincoln, I don't know if that would be true, but also if you wanted to bring up him as a specific example, I think there are other things to consider with that, which is that he was a politician, and in that respect, he has to consider what's actually going to get past other people and what things he might say that would completely turn other people off, right? And I don't think that other people would necessarily have that sort of concern and the
Well,
way
but I
they
kind
voice
of do,
their
right?
opinions.
Because in the end of the day, aren't I like kind of convincing people or persuading people?
Sure, but at the same time, I don't like when a politician has to persuade someone, right? They're trying to get votes so they can get something to happen. And although that may be the case for you in some respects, you already take a lot of extreme positions. Like I don't think that anybody feels compelled to like if you have a politician that says if we had Bernie Sanders come out tomorrow and literally say that he wanted like full on Marxist communism or something, right? Like nobody would ever listen to him for anything that he wanted ever for the rest of his political career, right? It'd be complete political suicide. But I don't think that you're in that same sort of position. If you were to take like a strong social stance on one particular issue, I feel like you've already done that on some things, right? Sometimes you have more moderate views and sometimes you have more extreme views. But I think that everyone in your audience realizes when they come to you, right?
I mean, and I talk about it
honest...
sometimes, but it's just like it's such a niche position that I don't know. It just feels like there's not much point in talking about it. Like, even people on the left aren't necessarily going to be on board with me there. So, like, why?
Well, okay. So, what I would say is this: when the trans issues thing first started coming to the forefront, like 3 or 4 years ago, whatever it was, I was at odds with a lot of my left friends on this issue. And so what I said is, I must be missing something. I should look into this more deeply.
Wait, hold on, one second. I got like paragraph Andes. 1 second.
Trans people's tiny.
Okay, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Okay. So a few years ago, I was at odds, so I said, there must be something I'm missing. I'm going to start looking into what people are saying about this. And I feel like all of the most prominent things that I could find were almost entirely always ContraPoints. And even when I found stuff sort of less popular than that, usually the things that were most critical that weren't straight up just Ben Shapiro were like videos of yours, which there are not very many of. And I don't think that gender abolitionism came up in any of the ones that I saw at the very least.
Gotcha, okay. Oh, wait, sorry. I was just referring to like a donation, by the way. I don't know if you thought I was talking about you or not. Sorry.
No, I understood.
Yeah, okay. Wait, so basically, what are you saying? That like people like ContraPoints and me should talk about like gender abolition more?
I would actually really enjoy that, yeah. I feel like, I like ContraPoints overall. I feel like, if I knew her in real life, that we would probably get along pretty well. But I also feel like, in a certain point, some of her content is more style than substance sometimes, and the format is a very one-sided thing, right? Like, she makes it all by herself. I don't feel like there's a good avenue for criticism of her work. And I feel like she's gotten so big at this point that it's really difficult to get any sort of meaningful conversation about anything that she says. Like, she is sort of the authority when it comes to trans issues online for left-leaning people, right? I don't feel like there's anybody that really challenges her on anything that she says in a meaningful way.
But I don't think she speaks against gender abolition, does she?
I don't think that she does, but I think that she kind of weasels out of some of the more nuanced elements of some of these parts of the conversation.
I guess I understand what you're saying, but at the end of the day, like I feel like she included, we're just gonna end up alienating a whole bunch of people by taking on a much more extreme position than like what needs to happen. Like,
what do you mean by that? Then
like,
what needs
there's
to happen?
already a lot of people. Like, for instance, you would agree if you don't buy into trans issues, you're never buying into gender abolition, right? Would you agree with that?
No, I don't think I would.
Wait,
Like,
so you think there are people that would think that, like, yeah, I could see us getting rid of all gender, but those same people would be like, yeah, I could see trans people as being like a real thing?
Well, this might be an issue that we have to, you and I, kind of go into more to understand, like, what exactly we think of the idea of gender abolitionism. Because I feel like, just from, like, looking at Facebook memes and dumb shit from people that don't do politics at all online, right? It seems to me like whenever I see some dumb shit shared that is making fun of trans issues or non-binary people or whatever, that it's almost always, what do you mean that your identity is this thing, but you express yourself in this other way, sort of thing, right? Or like any kind of like remotely non-binary view, or there's not just two genders or whatever. If you were to just say, look, gender is this idea of these sort of societal structures, and you don't necessarily have to conform to them, but some people are still choosing to, even though it doesn't really align with what you would really expect them to do.
Wait, but what you're talking about right now isn't gender abolition. Wait, what do you mean by gender abolitionism?
When I talk about gender abolitionism, what I'm really more getting at is the idea that I don't feel like the historical concept of gender, as we understand it in gender studies, really ultimately should be a part of whatever final framework we have for the way that we view people. I don't think that in a society that values individualism that makes any sense at all.
Wait, hold on, wait. I don't understand what you just said. Say that again. So what does gender abolitionism mean to you?
It is the idea that you're going to do your best to get rid of any sort of idea of like gendered roles, I guess. I don't know if you would really want to go with roles, but that you would want to mitigate to the best of your ability the role that gender plays in society. I don't know that it's really possible to like truly abolish it, which is maybe why the term isn't ultimately the best. But like, do your best to make it go away, right? For it to not be a factor in the way people live their lives.
Okay.
Would you agree with that definition?
Yeah, I guess so. Sure. But do you think so? Then back to my other question. Sorry, we have to like figure this out. So you think that you have an easier time convincing somebody to abolish the whole concept of gender than to convince somebody that trans people are a real thing?
Not to convince people that trans people are a real thing. I think the angle would be more that, look, you don't need to understand the way that some people think about gender in modern society. If you can just acknowledge that there are going to be people that do not want to conform to any sort of gender standard, right? Or that they're not going to want to conform to your gender standard. And that it should be okay for people to live their lives in whatever way they see fit, regardless of whatever label you want to apply to that. I feel like that would be way easier for a lot of more right-leaning people to swallow.
Okay, I guess. I mean, I disagree, and I don't know. I guess like I don't know. I don't feel like talking about trans issues that way. I don't feel like that would be easier. Like, I feel like man's brain in a woman's body is a way easier paradigm to understand than, oh, well, some people just don't believe in gender at all. That sounds that sounds so hard.
Whoa. Let's actually. So, what you just said, are you saying that you definitely believe that the pink brain, blue brain thing is 100% true? Because
no, but I'm saying it's
like
easier to get somebody to buy into that concept than the idea that like all gender is arbitrary and fake. That sounds
I'm curious why you're going to the idea of getting people to buy into pink brain, blue brain, when that's not even something that like even among like trans people is something that is necessarily well accepted yet. Like, don't
because
we
we're
only
not talking
have
about trans. I mean, would you? But because conservatives already work within that framework that men and women are biologically different, right? That's a conservative argument, right?
Right, but why would you try and make that argument if we don't have the evidence to support it yet?
Well, we do have the evidence to support that to some extent. That trans people's like fMRIs or whatever and shit like make their brains look more like the brains of the gender they identify with and the sex that they were born as, don't we? Isn't that a thing, or am I making that up? I feel like I've read that a ton.
Maybe I missed something. I feel like there was one study relatively recently, like within the last year, that said something like that. but that even within one of ContraPoint's recent videos, she said that she would not say that that is something she is convinced of yet, and that we only have preliminary studies on the matter.
Okay, then I guess we need more research there.
So, like, if you were to try and engage someone right now that is, like, you know, an enlightened centrist or some dumb shit, right? Just like an average Joe that you ran into on the street that was like, you know what, I think that, you know, the whole trans thing is dumb. If you knew this now, that we don't have, like, very strong evidence of the pink brain, blue brain thing yet, what sort of line would you go for trying to convince them of, you know, being, just even acknowledging, like, the identity of someone like a non-binary person?
I don't know. I don't know. I'll keep this in mind for the future. Okay.
Okay.
I have a really hard. I guess I've had so much experience talking to conservatives. I have this really hard time believing that if I were like have this conversation, like, oh well, listen, dude, like all gender is just totally arbitrary, man, and like these are all social constructs, and there's no way that like this is like a real thing at all, and trans people just don't follow those social constructs. One, that runs counterintuitive to most trans messaging, right? Most trans people don't say, oh well, I feel like I have no gender at all. Most trans people say, I feel like I identify as the opposite gender. So one, you're running incredibly contrary to to what most trans people say, and then two, you're totally removing the framework through which most conservatives understand gender and sex to work at all. Instead of just saying like, hey, just swap the brains and now you understand it, you're saying, hey, abolish the whole concept of gender, which, by the way, most of your religion and culture and family life are centered on. But I mean, we disagree on that. I don't think we'll ever agree with that point, because you're going to tell me that no, it's actually easier to convince them, but I don't see that at all. Like,
well, I feel like there's actually another angle to talk about with that, which is that in the stuff that you just said, you only talked about trans issues, right? Like, you didn't talk about anything related to people that are genderqueer or that are non-binary or anything.
Because
like
those
that.
are also more things that you'd have to. I don't know, man.
Right, but like whatever framework that we try and convince people on, shouldn't it be inclusive of those people?
No, you have to move one problem at a time. Like, if I was going to try to get my family to accept that, like, you know, like maybe I've got a brother that's gay, I'm not going to say like, oh, by the way, not only they're gay people, they're pansexual people, genderqueer people. I'm never going to like take on every single issue at once. I would never win. I would never gain any ground anywhere ever.
Okay, I get the idea of like trying to work in increments, but consider this, right? Like, if you were to push this super hard on someone, like not push it super hard on someone, but if you were to work really hard to try and convince someone of this idea, right, of just the trans aspect of things, and then like 6 months later, they were like, hey, I heard about this thing called non-binary people, and they don't really seem to fit into the framework that you talked about. What's up with that? And you were like, well, actually, the framework that I gave you before isn't really how I think about things, but I thought it would be easier for you to swallow. Do you think that they're going to be able to trust you?
Yes, because that's how progress. Yeah, because that's how progress on every single social issue has ever worked. Unless you can think of something to the contrary, I can think of civil rights for black people, and then I can think of like gay like marriage rights. These are the two examples that I'm going by. If you have an example of where we went from one paradigm and radically shifted to another on any social issue, I would be super curious to hear about it.
Well, take gay marriage as the example. How do you feel that fits to this? Like, how do you feel like it's analogous?
Like in the 1800s or the early 1900s, we weren't saying like, oh, like gay people should be able to be married and have loving families and adopt kids. It was more like, well, maybe we shouldn't like, you know, make sodomy, you know, like legal, or maybe like the idea of being gay shouldn't be like punishable by law. And then from there it was like, well, maybe gay people should be allowed to like have relationships and it could be okay. And then from there it was like, well, maybe civil unions are an okay thing. And then from there it was like, okay, maybe gay people should be allowed to get married and then like adopt kids and everything. Like it's always like a gradual process.
I mean, so that's true, but that's also with dealing with a single group of people and then slowly giving them rights. We're not talking about giving a single group of people rights in this case, right? We're talking about separate groups of people that we want to be able to be accepted, like, or rather to be believed about their identity, right?
Okay, if like you record me, okay, I believe you record me a conversation of this. I would love to see. I'm very confident that this could never happen. The idea of taking somebody like my mom or taking like a standard conservative and then getting them, instead of like I am very confident that I could push a conservative to believe that trans people are real. That I could say like, hey, some people are born with, there's some weird things where people are born with whatever crazy different shit. Sometimes women are born with men brains. Sometimes men are born with women brains. That I could get somebody on board with that topic, and I could actually make progress there. But I would be shocked if I could ever see a conversation where you would get like a Rush Limbaugh type to believe in like genderqueer people from nothing, from without even believing in trans rights, to get them to believe in full-on like abolition of gender. I would never see that happening. It sounds like the most politically ineffective way to do anything ever.
I feel like Rush Limbaugh is maybe a more extreme example than I would take.
Rush Limbaugh is the most popular radio host in the entire United States. Like,
I mean, maybe it's just been way too long since I've listened to anything of his, right? But my impression of him was that he was like hyper conservative. Is this not true?
Rush Limbaugh, I mean, he's fairly conservative. No, I would say he's not hyper conservative. He's not like alt-right or alt-right or anything.
Okay.
I don't think he's like overtly
I'm not,
racist.
Super familiar with him.
Sure, he's just like standard like Republican conservative.
Okay, sure. Well, I think the angle that I would talk about more there is, though, that it seems most intuitive to me that if you were to present the framework under which most people talk about trans issues, right? This from a purely gender identity perspective, right? It's like, I am a man or a woman, not because of anything related to my biology, but I just am. It simply is. And
you're already at it. That's like such an extreme position that you're already at. Like, you're talking to people who believe that God created man in the image of God, like in his own eyes, like he's created in a certain image, and you're telling people to deny that like fundamental part of the existence of man. Like, you're already like in an extreme territory there. Like, what do you mean people don't identify their sex or their gender? Like, God literally created us man and woman, like since the start.
What do you mean that I didn't say that? Where are you getting that from?
It sounds like you're telling me that like you're giving me like an argument for why we shouldn't care about like the body parts you have or whatever.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, explain what you just said again.
No. You like kind of cut me off mid-sentence. Where I was going to go with it was that I feel like if you present the framework under which we usually talk about trans issues, right, and then you later at some point tried to transition into talking about the framework through which most, like, for example, non-binary people talk about their identity, and said that these things often are not compatible in the way that people present them, right? That there are aspects of it that definitely conflict with each other. And that if the average person that really doesn't want to put very much thought into this sort of thing was first convinced of, for example, trans issues, and then was later tried to present the non-binary aspect to them, that they would be resentful of the fact that they had.
People don't work that way. Nobody's gonna be resentful. Like, oh well, first you told me it was just this, and now it's this. If anything, they'll be more warm to the ideas because they've already bought into one thing. Like, this is how we push people further to the left on like certain like social issues, like or even like policy issues like healthcare, right? Like, getting the average American to accept like socialism, like 50 years ago would probably be fucking impossible. But after getting like the ACA and after like having like more international relations with other countries, you kind of warm up to the idea more.
I mean, I suppose that's true in some extent, but I also don't feel like there was ever the idea that, like, I don't feel like a lot of people, well, this might not be true. So I guess if you were to take the stance that, someone was a Democratic or a social democrat, for example, right now, and then, 30 years from now, they were actually socialists, and they were like, I've kind of changed my mind, and this is sort of how I feel about things now. I feel like you can explain those sort of changes in mentality organically. Like, you can say there are reasons that my opinion has changed over time. But I feel like if you right now are someone who would describe yourself as a gender abolitionist, right, that you acknowledge right in this moment that the concept of gender should probably just be done away with for the most part, that if you go and you convince someone of, actually I believe, think about things in this framework that you don't actually believe in, and then you try to convince them of a different framework later, that it would be more difficult to get them to trust you.
I don't think anybody thinks like that. Nobody like keeps a tab on like positions they've been convinced of. Like, if somebody's like, oh, well, I'm pushing for 15 an hour minimum wage, and then later you're like, okay, cool, well, we have this, maybe we should just move to UBI, that someone's going to think like, well, hold on, you convinced me of minimum wage, now you want to do UBI. I don't trust you, you're just lying. Like, I don't think anybody thinks like keeps a record like that of issues.
We'll take this example. So I think that you and I are a similar age, so you were probably late high school or early college when the whole gay marriage thing was going on, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so with gay marriage, among religious people, something that came up very frequently was that you had to explain that being gay is not a choice, right? You said it shouldn't matter what they want to do in the bedroom, but if you really care, it's not even up to them. They don't get to make a decision about this, right? So, like, any argument that you're trying to make about them needing to change is going to be completely fruitless because it's not even an option, right? If you were to instead now find that there was a study that said, oh, actually, sexual orientation, completely fabricated concept. Who you're interested in is actually a choice. Like if there was some sort of study that could somehow prove that, although I don't think that's going to end up being the case, right? Then you would have tons of people that would come out and be like, well, hold on here. Like a decade ago, you guys were all claiming this, and it was total bullshit. Don't ever believe the liberals anymore. Do you not think that would be the case?
I mean, people do this anyway, like with stuff where it's not even like proven false, I guess.
Could you give me an example?
Like climate change. People say, oh, well, the liberals were all saying we would die 20 years ago and we're not dead yet, so they're all lied. Like, people say this anyway with stuff like...
Did anybody actually say that we were going to die 20 years ago, though?
Probably not, but people make it up regardless.
I mean, I guess so. You could just assume that there are going to be people that act in bad faith anyways to sort of represent these arguments that...
Yeah, but I think those are the only
baseless.
people who would say this. Like, I don't think that, like, normal people are going to be like, oh, well, first you convinced me of the ACA and now you're trying to do single payer, like you're lying about everything. I don't know, I just don't think people, like, think this way.
I really don't feel like that any sort of legislative policy is completely analogous to this, but... Like, I don't know, I guess our experiences are just different in this. I feel like, my intuition is that I know I could identify a lot of people that I've met in my own life that would have that sort of reaction, right? That they would just, for whatever limited amount that you could get them to engage with these sorts of topics, right? Like, just to be like, maybe you should use the pronouns for trans people that they want you to use. Like, if you just convince them of that element and then later presented a framework that sort of, said that, well, the whole trans thing, it didn't completely fit into the framework that I really believe in. There were other elements that I wasn't really telling you.
But that's not how you would say. You wouldn't say, like, I lied to you about it. You would just, like, try to warm them up to more ideas.
I mean, I suppose that's true, right? But, like, do you not feel like there is going to be difficulty among this sort of person in distinguishing the nuance in that?
I don't know. Okay, I will keep this in mind for future conversations, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Talk to Contra at some point if you could. I would really enjoy that. I think you guys would have a good conversation.
All right. I mean, we've spoken to each other in the past, but I will try to talk to her again, okay?
All right. Thanks, bud.
All right. Bye. The black dude's hands go down pretty low here, and this guy hasn't assassinated him yet, so it's probably not real.